Welcome to The Explainer. You know, when we hear the word Ebola, our minds almost immediately jump to the terrifying initial outbreaks. But today, we're diving into a fascinating medical detective story to look at the complete picture. We're going to trace this virus from the microscopic mechanics of its attack all the way to the invisible scars it leaves behind long after the virus itself is actually gone. Here's a quick look at our roadmap for today. We'll start with the anatomy of an invasion, move on to dry and wet symptoms, explore the survivor's aftermath, and finally discuss stigma and invisible scars. All right, Section 1, Anatomy of an Invasion. We're starting at the very beginning, zooming way into the microscopic level to see exactly how a tiny 19 kilobase viral threat operates. Get this, the Ebola virus genome is incredibly small. It's just a single strand of RNA that encodes for exactly 7 structural proteins. To put that into perspective, the human-hosted attacks has over 20,000. But this is a highly specialized, ruthless demolition crew. The glycoprotein, or GP, acts as a skeleton key to unlock the host cell. Meanwhile, proteins like VP35 and VP24 are actively suppressing your immune system, basically cutting the body's alarm wires before it even knows it's under attack. Now, the way it gets in is honestly a masterful piece of cellular deception. Instead of forcefully drilling through the cell wall, the virus triggers a process called macropinocytosis. It essentially puts on a disguise, literally tricking the host cell's own membrane into folding inward and swallowing the virus whole. Once it's inside, it uses a specific cholesterol transporter protein called Niaminpic, C1, to dump its genetic payload directly into the cell. And once that payload is released, a devastatingly efficient replicative cycle kicks off. A protein called VP30 regulates the transcription of the viral genome. It completely hijacks the cell, forcing it to stop its normal jobs and start acting as a factory to assemble new viral particles. Finally, these new virions gather at the membrane and push their way out in a process called budding, which destroys the host cell as they rush off to infect millions more. Moving on to Section 2, Dry and Wet Symptoms. With the cellular breach complete, the battlefield shifts from the microscopic level directly to the human body. After the initial exposure, the virus can actually sit silently in the body for anywhere from 2 to 21 days, usually averaging around 8 to 10 days. During this window, the patient feels perfectly fine, all while that microscopic replication cycle is scaling up exponentially. But once that incubation period breaks, the body systems crash with shocking speed. The illness typically unfolds in 2 very distinct phases. At first, the body mounts an immune response that looks a lot like other mild illnesses: fever, severe headache, and just profound fatigue. We call this the dry phase. But usually by day 4 or 5, as the virus aggressively tears into the vascular system and gastrointestinal tract, the patient transitions into the devastating wet phase. This brings severe vomiting, diarrhea, and in critical cases, unexplained bleeding. Now, here is why this is so dangerous. Those early dry symptoms are incredibly generic. Think about it. A patient showing up with a fever and headache in a region where malaria or typhoid are common might easily be misdiagnosed, sent home, or put in an open ward. This generic presentation acts like a Trojan horse, allowing the virus to spread undetected in the early days of an outbreak. It's exactly why strict infection control and safe burial practices are absolutely vital. Which brings us to Section 3, the survivor's aftermath. Because for the thousands of patients who actually beat the acute viral infection, we really have to ask, what happens next? What is life like when you're finally discharged with a negative test result? If we look at some clinical data from a Médecins Sans Frontières clinic in Sierra Leone, we start to see the real timeline of post-EVD syndrome. In a study tracking 166 patients, survivors returned for medical help an average of 51 days after being discharged. So the acute virus was completely gone from their blood, but their bodies were still very much in crisis. The physical toll of this aftermath is immense. Almost 78% of survivors suffered from severe joint pain, or arthralgia, while nearly 70% had lingering profound fatigue. And we aren't just talking about feeling a little tired. This is debilitating physical pain that stops these folks from returning to work, harvesting their crops, or even just caring for their families. Eye issues are also incredibly common here, specifically uveitis, which threatens long-term disability and even blindness if left untreated. Over half of the patients in the MSF study experienced some sort of ocular complication. You see, the virus is known to hide out in immunologically privileged sites, like the fluid of the eye, long after it clears the bloodstream, creating severe inflammation that can permanently damage a person's vision. And here is a truly staggering takeaway from the data. Survivors are literally 10 times more likely to develop uveitis if they had red, injected eyes during the acute phase of their illness. This is exactly why collecting detailed clinical data is a game changer. By spotting this correlation, doctors can flag patients who had red eyes in the treatment center and prioritize them for immediate eye screenings the second they're discharged. It can literally save their sight. This point emphasizes a massive shift in how the medical community needs to view recovery. Medical care absolutely cannot end the moment a patient tests negative. The traditional model usually just focuses on containment and acute treatment, but this clinical data proves we need a holistic approach, where follow-up clinics are baked into the outbreak response right from day one. And finally, Section 4, Stigma and Invisible Scars. Let's zoom out one last time to the community level. Because while the physical complications are devastating, the mental and social hurdles can be equally paralyzing. Survivors return home carrying a heavy burden. They have neurological symptoms, deep grief, and very visible markers like hair loss. Imagine surviving one of the most lethal viruses on the planet, only to return home grieving the loss of multiple family members. Plus, nearly 32% of survivors experience significant hair loss, which acts as a glaring physical sign to the whole community that they were infected. And that leads to a heartbreaking reality: the profound social stigma and isolation survivors face from their own friends and neighbors. Over a quarter of survivors reported feeling deep shame, and a similar number said people in their community actively avoided them. Some even faced discrimination inside their own households. The fear of the virus is just so deeply ingrained that survivors are often treated as outcasts long after they're no longer contagious. A slow and painful recovery. This phrase was first noted all the way back in the 1976 Sudan outbreak, and it remains a tragically accurate summary of the survivor's journey today. It's a sobering reminder that even though our understanding of microscopic proteins and cellular pathways has advanced tremendously, the human experience of recovering from Ebola is still an incredibly steep mountain to climb. From that tricky cellular deception that kicks off the infection, to the severe physical pain and crushing social stigma that lingers for years, the story of Ebola definitely does not end with a negative blood test. If we truly want to heal communities, our care systems have to be designed to treat the entire timeline of this disease. Which leaves us with one vital question to consider today. When the outbreak ends, how do we ensure the survivors aren't left fighting alone?